Thank you for the invitation, and sorry that I can't be there in person to participate, and apologies also for the IT situation before. I hope it goes smoothly now. Although we are experiencing floods at the moment and there are electricity cuts, so I hope nothing happens during my presentation. If there are any issues with the sound, just let me know. So as it was said in the presentation, I'm a behavioral scientist, and today I'll be talking about how we can bring behavioral science to support in terms of understanding what are the determinants of the behaviors that we want to promote and change, and how we can use science to do that. So I've divided my talk in 3 parts. So I'll start by very briefly explaining what is behavioral science. I'm sure that many of you in the room know what I'm talking about, but still I think it is important to define exactly what we mean by behavioral science and where it is useful. I will then move to talk about the behavior change process. So the importance of identifying correctly the behaviors that we want to target, the determinants of behavior using theory, how we identify and select behavior change techniques to change those behaviors. And I'll give examples of applying this to motivation and self-regulation skills, which is an important topic within the domain of many of you in the room. And I will end, of course, with some take-home messages and reflections, and we'll have time for discussion at the end. So when we use the term behavioral science, and because there is a huge hype about behavioral science at the moment, it is important to define what we are talking about. And one of the reasons why behavioral science is so much in the core of all media coverage at the moment, especially with COVID-19, it's mainly because of the complexity of human behavior. So until a few decades ago, a lot of our interventions and ways that we would approach human behavior would be very much focused on looking at how we can provide information and increase knowledge about risk factors, protective behaviors, and hope that by providing information, people would engage in healthier behaviors and would do what is relevant and important to them. But what we know from decades of research is that there are many more determinants that can explain human behavior, and a few were actually mentioned in the talk earlier today by Everett, where he explained the importance of looking at social economic, contextual factors, cultural factors, physiological factors, behavioral factors, psychological factors, etc. And to be able to do that, we need to use evidence-based approach and look at what theories can do and help in terms of developing and implementing behavior change interventions. And there has been a lot of work conducted recently in trying to improve our knowledge within this area, especially in the health behavior domain, and also try to bring different methodologies to help us in using more standardized approaches, because that's what is going to help us in bringing evidence-based together. So when we talk about behavioral science, we mean using theories that we have from psychology, from sociology, economics, health sciences, and different disciplines, as well as using methods, systematic methods that can help us, such as taxonomies, ontologies, using experimental testing, etc., to understand and influence all sorts of behaviors, although today we are more focused on health-related behaviors. And this is done to develop behavior change interventions. So by behavior change interventions, we mean any type of activity, product, strategy that is implemented to change a behavioral pattern of only one individual, a group of people, or a larger population if we're targeting people in a more of a public health approach. And the work that is being done in research is to move forward to have this evidence-based behavior change approach that can be as personalized as possible. So the more we identify what is happening with individual, the more we can personalize the interventions that we do. So just very simply, to explain this process, what you can see in the screen now, it's a diagram explaining what is the flow that we have in terms of understanding how to change behaviors. So we start by defining health outcomes, if we're talking about health-related behaviors. We then move to identify what are the behaviors that are relevant to produce those health outcomes, to then identify the sources of those behaviors. Are we talking about behaviors, for example, physical activity, that are influenced by social determinants, or are they influenced by cognitive determinants or emotional determinants, or a mix of them? So what are the barriers and facilitators to change? And it's based on this process that we can go to the final level of identifying which techniques and strategies are actually going to be effective in practice when we work with populations. So for example, if we think about prevention of injuries, one of the important behaviors is for athletes to follow a diet according to recommendations, so the guidelines that exist that are constantly being updated, of course, and we can identify different determinants. If we identify in that population that we are working with, that confidence, self-efficacy, so the confidence that the person has in prepare adequate meals that have the right nutritional balance, then we can use a behavior change strategy that is mostly focused on modeling, so demonstrating how to prepare meals or even providing information on how to select the best ingredients. So this identification of the behavior change strategy and technique is always a result of the determinant that we identify, so the barrier to the behavior that we identify. And in behavioral science, we bring together theories to explain this process. So theories help us in understanding how determinants relate with each other. And in relation to the FULGUR project, which is the topic of today's seminar, if you look at the examples that I brought here from what is being targeted in terms of assessment and intervention strategies, we have here a mix of different behaviors that are important for injury prevention, such as hydration, sleeping well, training, and other aspects related with the determinants, motivation, emotions, etc. So we need to take into consideration what are the behaviors and the determinants that are involved to actually be able to change all of these preventive behaviors that we want for injury prevention. So what we mean by identifying determinants of the behavior. So we need to understand what are the barriers and facilitators to change at different times. And this is going to help us in generating changes. What is really relevant and important at the moment, and it's one of the reasons why research and our knowledge has really increased in the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years, is because we now have technologies that allow us to do assessments repeatedly and with more accurate measures, more timely, more dynamic, which also allows us to intervene when it's most needed. And before in a talk today, it was mentioned that what are the risk factors that are relevant for different athletes are going to change with time. So we need to assess that, but we also need to assess what are the barriers to actually engage in those behaviors. So we need to approach the assessment in a way that is dynamic so that we can identify changes in the determinants over time. Theories, as I said before, can help us in explain and predict behavior because they help in specifying what are the most relevant determinants of the behavior. So if we identify that for a specific behavior, we have emotional and cognitive aspects that are relevant, then we can design an intervention that is going to target those determinants. But it gets more complex than that because there will be interactions between the cognitive aspects, like, for example, self-efficacy, self-regulation skills, which is the ability that I have to plan, to set goals, to do problem solving and other self-regulation skills that we can train. If we identify that there is emotional and self-regulation skills, for example, issues, theories will show us how they interact with each other. So how are their emotions related with self-regulation skills? How do self-regulation skills relate back to that? And how is that related with behavior? And it's the complexity of the theories that can help us in design interventions and strategies that can be more effective for a given population. So they help us not only in identifying the targets for an intervention, but also in explaining how and why an intervention works. So what was the main process? What was the main determinant? If we select different strategies that are targeting self-efficacy, goal setting, action planning, problem solving, emotional regulation, how do we know which determinant was actually a mechanism of action in that intervention? Which change in each determinant was responsible for a change in a behavior? If we use theories and the relationships that are established in theories, that can help us in understanding why some interventions work or don't work and how they work. So what are the main mechanisms of action? And of course, this will lead to optimizing the effects of an intervention, because if we then test these different elements and we go back after testing them and selecting what are the techniques that are more important for which determinants, then we are optimizing the intervention. So we're using our resources to target exactly what is useful for that person in that given context, in that given moment. So at the moment, we have identified 83 formal theories of behavior change, which is a lot of theories. Of course, that these theories will focus on different determinants. So we have theories that focus more on social aspects. We have theories that focus more on the individual aspects. We have theories that are very much focused on cognitive aspects. And we have theories that are very much focused on emotional aspects. And we also have what we call the integrative models that try to approach these different aspects at the same time. Within these 83 theories, and of course, they are not all targeting the same behaviors, we have 1,738 determinants of behavior, which again is a lot of determinants. Of course, there is overlap between theories. So a lot of theories of behavior change will talk about self-efficacy. I'm sure that many of you in the room have heard about social cognitive theory or theory of planned behavior. These are core theories that try to explain behavior in which self-efficacy or similar determinants are quite relevant. So there is a line of work in trying to look at the overlaps between determinants and actually help in selecting which determinants are more relevant. But the broad idea here is that we have a huge corpus of knowledge identifying which theories can be applied to understand behavior and changing behavior for which behaviors and what are the main constructs within these theories. Because there are so many theories of behavior change and not all theories will explain the full process, and some of these theories will actually be quite complicated for people in practice to implement them. More recently, colleagues from the University College of London have developed a very simple integrative model just to explain the importance of identifying determinants of behavior, and who try to classify these determinants in three broader categories. So according to this model called the COMBI model, capability, opportunity, and motivation model, we have three broader categories that can explain what is in the source of any behavior. So if you look at the behavior box, the blue box, you can think of behaviors related with injury prevention. So you can think of things related with nutritional behaviors, but you can also think of physical activity, reduced sedentary behavior, smoking cessation, or even behaviors related with energy saving. So it doesn't have to be necessarily in the health domain. And for any behavior that you can think of, for the more simple to the more complex one, when you start to think about why do people engage or do not engage in this behavior, you will have a list of many different reasons that will come to your mind, right? So if we think about physical activity, people may not do physical activity because they don't have the equipment to do so. They don't have access to places to do physical activity. They feel too exhausted to do it. The weather is bad, so they want to do it. They don't value. They don't see the importance. They have tried it before and they fail. So you can think of 10, 15, 20, 100 reasons, depending on the person you're thinking about. But all of these aspects will fall into these three categories: capability, motivation, and opportunity. And within capability, we have aspects related with physical capability, if the person is physically able to do something. Related with psychological capability, so the skills, the mental skills that the person has to do and perform a behavior, and the knowledge that the person has about the behavior. If you go to motivation, we'll have aspects related with the reflective motivation. So our beliefs, our goals, it's the elements of motivation that required some thinking about it. But we also have aspects of automatic motivation. So the emotional aspects, the impulses, the desires, the habits are a really powerful barrier or facilitator to behavior that fall within the automatic motivation category. And then finally, if you think of opportunity, you have aspects related with physical opportunity, for example, access to services, and aspects related with social opportunity. So the amount of support that you receive from colleagues, friends, family, coaches, teachers, bosses, whatever is the context, to support you within that specific behavior. The reason why I'm mentioning this model is just to give you an example of how we can look at the determinants and classify determinants in a way that can be useful to develop interventions, and to show you that it doesn't have to be hugely complex with theories that require reading 1,000 pages to understand what is going on. So we can use simple models. But what happens, and what we know, is that for specific behaviors, we will have what we call the formal theories that will explain each of these elements in more detail. For example, for health-related behaviors, namely physical activity and dietary behaviors, we have a large body of research showing that motivation and different aspects of motivation are crucial for sustainable physical activity and healthy dietary behaviors. And there is one particular theory called the self-determination theory that I will talk about a bit later in my talk, that has shown very good and promising results in explaining this behavior. So depending on what you identify as a core determinant or determinants in the behavior that you're targeting, you may want to use these theories to help you in understanding how the intervention can be effective. I give you here an example of a meta-analysis that was conducted already a few years ago, looking at the efficacy of theory-based interventions in the physical activity domain. So it was a comparison between interventions that were theory-based, so they were really based on theory, and interventions that were not based on theory. And looking at 82 trials that were part of this meta-analysis, you can see from the results, if you look at the pooled analysis results, although I know this is quite small in the screen, the results overall favor theory-based interventions against control interventions, although the results are quite small and there is large variability between studies. One of the core reasons why there is variability between studies is not necessarily because these theories aren't relevant or they only have small effects, but it is in many cases because when interventions use theories of behavior change to support what they are doing, there are a lot of situations in which the theory is not well implemented. So the authors, the interventionists might say that they used self-determination theory, just to use the same example, or the combi model, but then in practice, they are only using elements of it. They are not using it properly with the extension that should be used. And of course, this is going to impact on the results. In the same meta-analysis, there was an analysis of which theories could be more relevant. And as I mentioned before, self-determination theory is one of the most effective in this domain, although there are less studies than for other theories. And also the authors found that interventions based on single theory were more effective than interventions based on multiple theories. Again, this doesn't necessarily mean that combining theories is a bad thing. It means that in a lot of cases, the combination of theories doesn't follow a systematic approach of understanding which theories need to be combined, why, and how to do that in practice. To give you another example, in sports, there was a recent review looking at sports nutrition interventions and trying to identify the use of theory and the use of behavior change techniques in these interventions. And in 16 studies, the authors found that only 3 studies reported using theory, mainly using social cognitive theory, the health belief model, and the combi model. So only three studies did it. Other studies, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was other 6 studies, mentioned using some constructs, some determinants, but there was no information about how they were used, how they were implemented, how they were assessed, and how they were targeted. So once we identify the main determinants that are relevant for a given behavior, and the theoretical approach for that, we move into the stage of looking into the behavior change techniques. And by behavior change techniques, we mean the active ingredients of a behavior change intervention. So in the same way that when you talk about a drug, a medication intervention, you have different chemical components. In a behavior change intervention, you also have different components that are going to be implemented. So this is really the smallest unit that has potential on itself to influence behavior. So if we look at the examples here, you might have an intervention that only consists of action planning, and action planning is considered the technique in that intervention that is going to change the behavior. So going back to previous examples, if we identify that the reason why someone doesn't adhere to healthy dietary guidelines is because that person isn't capable of planning their day in terms of preparing and bringing and eating healthy meals and healthy snacks, one of the strategies that can be implemented is action planning. So it's identifying when the person needs to do the behavior, how that person needs to do the behavior, with whom, under what circumstances, etc. The thing that is really important in terms of behavior change techniques is that they also need to be measured. So we need to be able to measure if by using an action planning technique in an intervention, were there actually changes? So can we actually measure if the action planning was enacted, was implemented, improved, and resulted, of course, in changes in behaviors? So we can have behavior change interventions that have only one behavior change technique, as I mentioned, but we can also have behavior change interventions that have multiple behavior change techniques. So going back again to the example I showed before, based on the determinants that we find, we will select different behavior change techniques. And in this diagram, you have two different examples. So demonstration as modeling and providing information as another behavior change technique. Because again, we need to make this process systematic and understand which behavior change techniques should I use? How many behavior change techniques are out there? Which ones are? What do they mean? How can I implement them? Researchers have been trying to develop classification systems of behavior change techniques for different domains. And these classification systems, which are commonly either taxonomies or ontologies or just compendium of techniques, are very useful, both for intervention development, so based on the diagram of the process that I showed before, but also to guide reporting. It can also help for those that are reporting their strategies, their interventions, what they did in practice, to use these classifications of behavior change techniques to provide a reporting of what they did that is actually accurate and that other people can look at it, understand, replicate, and test if needed. What is common for all of these classification systems, so the main ones that are published and exist out there, and also a note on this, all the classification systems of behavior change techniques that exist are freely open to anyone to access, to anyone to get training, to get more information, to use, and even to provide input to improve them. What is common to all of these classification systems is that they started by being developed based on in-depth literature reviews. So researchers go back to all the intervention research protocols and papers that were published for a certain behavior or for more than one behavior, and identify the behavior change techniques that were used on those behaviors. And in certain cases, depending on the classification system, they also go to the theory to see what theory is proposed. Then based on the first list of techniques, there is always an expert consensus-based approach. So experts are consulted to provide their feedback. And all of these classification systems provide clear and unique labels, so names for the techniques, descriptions, and examples. The main behavior change techniques classification that exists at the moment and that is being widely used, just to give you an idea, the behavior change techniques taxonomy V1 is part of the World Health Organization guidelines for developing and implementing behavior change interventions, is part of the UK and other country guidelines for clinical practice and excellence in clinical practice, is used as part of policy guides, is used as part of books and manuals. So it's one of the main classification systems that at the moment is being used to report, to annotate, and to develop research. So the behavior change techniques taxonomy V1 that was developed by the Center for Behavior Change. So Susan Mickey is the main researcher and health psychologist leading this line of work, is a general classification of techniques that can be applied to any behavior that you can think about. And it has 93 behavior change techniques that are organized in 16 groupings. And here I just give you, because we don't have enough time to go through everything, I just give you an example of some of the BCTs, the behavior change techniques that you can find in the taxonomy. For example, goal setting for behavior is defined as setting or agreeing on a goal that is defined in terms of the behavior to be achieved. An example is agreeing on a daily intake of specific nutrients. Another technique can be instructions on how to perform the behavior, which is defined as advising or agreeing on how to perform the behavior. It can include skills training, and an example is to advise the person on how to prepare meals with the correct nutritional balance. So for each of the 93 behavior change techniques that exist in the taxonomy, there are examples, illustrations for all of them. Another very recent classification that was developed 2 years ago by colleagues in Finland, and I was part of the group developing this classification, is a compendium of self-enactable techniques. And this compendium might be useful for some of you in the room, because the main idea was to develop a classification of techniques that can be implemented by the person itself. So if we think about promoting self-regulation and an autonomous process of adhering and having sustained healthy and protective behaviors, it was really important that we provide strategies that can be implemented by the person in by itself without needing support from others in doing so. So the main purpose of this classification system is to provide a list of the techniques that are available. And it also provides a toolkit that was written in a lay person language so that anyone can use it. And this classification system has 123 techniques, and it was based on revision from techniques from the health domain, organizational and work domain, but also sports behavior and the sports domain. So a lot of the techniques there in this compendium will be familiar for those of you that work in sports science. So as an example, if you look at problem solving, the way it is defined is analyzing factors influencing the behavior and generating or selecting strategies to overcome barriers to performing that given behavior. And we have examples that are written in a way that a person can do it. So in this case, having a plan can help you overcome barriers to changing behavior. You can start by identifying the things that keep you from being active. Then you can identify ways of doing it. And it also provides ways of doing it in a way that is more effective. So for example, we know from research that developing coping plans, so plans to deal with barriers, using an if-then model, if contingency, there is something happen, then I will do this, is more effective than just saying, I'm going to do this whenever I need to do it. So if you put the contingency first and then the solution, it can be more effective. So the compendium also provides information for that. And also if there are any risks, if you need external input, and if it is aligned with other techniques or not. In terms of looking at using techniques, there have been many meta-analyses and systematic reviews published in the last few years. So depending on your area of interest, if you do a quick search, you will find a lot of information, I'm sure, about which techniques have been used, which ones are more effective, which ones are more relevant, frequency, etc. So going back to the review that I showed before in sports nutrition interventions that had 16 studies included, the one that I mentioned that only 3 studies use theory, this review also looked at the use of behavior change techniques. And what was found in all of these studies is that only 19 techniques from the total of 93 techniques were used, so 80%. So this can be either because not other techniques are needed, so these are the only techniques that we needed interventions, but because the effects of interventions are quite small, this also points to the fact that there might be other techniques that could be useful, but people are not implementing them because they are not using this systematic approach of identifying the determinants, the theoretical background, and then the techniques. This comes from the same paper. So if you go to the paper, there will be a list of all the techniques used. This is just an example, a screenshot of a few of them. And there will be an indication of which studies use which technique, and also a relation between the use of the techniques and the effects of the interventions, which in this case, the authors didn't find a relation between that. The other thing that is really important from this meta-analysis and other similar papers is that the description of the techniques, sometimes it's so different that we are not even sure if people are actually implementing the same technique. The other important aspect of using behavioral science to help us in selecting how we can intervene, how we can use specific strategies and implement them, is because it can help us in identifying what is the optimal way of doing it. So you have here an example of a meta-analysis just looking at goal setting. So interventions using goal setting to change behaviors across behaviors. And this is one of the main techniques that is implemented. So the authors included 141 studies with 384 effect sizes. And as you can see, there were small effects of goal setting across this range of behaviors, again, with a bit of variability between studies, but also to say it's quite normal that we only find small to moderate effects because we're only talking about one technique. And sometimes it's only implemented, once in some studies, which also brings issues. But what the authors found in this paper, and I think this is a really important part, they conducted moderator analysis to understand different characteristics of the goal setting that could potentially explain differences in the effect sizes of the interventions that were included in the meta-analysis. And the authors, what they found was that in goal setting was mainly effective in interventions where the goal was more difficult, so challenging. I don't think this is the correct term, but it means challenging. It was done publicly, so people could set their goals and other people were aware of that goals. I'm sure this moderator can lead to a lot of positive and negative reactions at the same time from people, and also being a group goal, which of course, this only makes sense in certain behaviors and circumstances. So whenever the goal was made by a group of people, it was more effective than when done individually. And if you want to look at this paper, you'll also find other types of moderators that were analyzed that didn't explain any differences in effects. So moving now a bit to the next stage. So I spoke about the importance of identifying determinants and theories, the importance of using classifications and systematic approaches to identify the techniques that can be used in interventions. But now, as I mentioned before, when I show the diagram of the behavior change process, we now need to bring all of this together. And bringing all of this together means understanding how it is linked. So how the determinants linked with the behavior change techniques. And because, of course, I don't have time to approach everything that can be done in this area in terms of theory-based approaches, I selected motivation and self-regulation skills as examples that I'm going to bring you and talk about on how we can link the determinants with the techniques. So if we think about promoting self-regulation skills, and as I said before, self-regulation skills are really important in changing behaviors, and there is high consensus from research on that. We need to think about what are the kind of techniques that actually can promote changes in self-regulation skills. And some of the techniques that we have that are listed on the left side are self-monitoring of behavior. So as you all know, it's monitoring one's own behavior, using activity trackers, using diaries, using biofeedback, using all sorts of technologies. Personalized feedback, so when you give feedback or receive feedback based on your own progression. Looking at the discrepancy and evaluating the discrepancy between the standards that you want to achieve and the behavior in itself. So this is where I think I am in relation to this behavior, and this is what I want to achieve. Goal setting that I already mentioned before, action planning, coping planning, which is problem solving, and also action control. And then action control has a lot of strategies in itself. So it is not one behavior change technique. It is a set of behavior change techniques, but it's mainly when people use different techniques to keep in control of their goal. So they pay attention to the goal, they are capable of dealing with external disturbances and all of those elements that allow them to control what is happening in terms of progressing towards their goals. And when we look at all of these techniques on the left side, all of which are targeting self-regulation skills, so they are aiming to promote an increase in self-regulation skills, we see that these techniques are actually explained by a theory of behavior change called control theory, also known as self-regulation theory. So this is a theory that was already developed in 1998, and this is only a part of the theory that I bring here today. It is the main aspect of the theory. And what the control theory tells us is that all people will change their behaviors if they are targeting a goal that is relevant to them. And by a goal that is relevant to them, this means a goal that is related with where they want to go, so what they want to achieve and where they are now. And to do that, they use a comparison, right? So they will compare their current behavior with guidelines or with others or with themselves previously or with what they think it is useful for them. So this means that they need to use self-monitoring, and then they need to have feedback to understand and make this comparison, right? Based on this comparison, they will set goals. So we have the output function. And when I say they will set goals, this can be done, of course, by the person in itself, together with a coach, together with a physiotherapist, together with a psychologist, with another interventionist. It really doesn't matter the way that is done for the purpose of what I'm explaining today. Based on that, the person will start to implement action planning and coping planning approaches to lead to be able to make sure that they will succeed in striving and achieving their goal. And they will also implement aspects of action control every time there are disturbances, external or internal disturbances that can limit them in their process of goal striving. Of course, this will have an effect on the environment that will influence. They will again check their goal progress, and they will do the same process. So this is called the feedback loop, where we go through the process all over again. This is one of the best examples that we have in which the techniques that have been assessed, analyzed, and looked at all over again in research and shown to be promising in changing behaviors, especially aspects related with self-monitoring and feedback, are explained by a theory. So in this case, by control theory. So it makes sense that when I'm identifying what I need to do in an intervention, if I identify that the main determinant is lack of self-regulation skills, specific skills, or more than one skills, I will implement these techniques. But also, according to this theory, it only makes sense to implement all of these techniques if we implement them in combination. And more than in combination, we need to implement them in sequency. So the relevance of using the theory here is because it will help us in understanding not only why these techniques work, but how we can make these techniques work better and be even more effective. And in this case, if we use all of these techniques, not in the order that I present here, because the discrepancy and the self-monitoring go alongside, but using this approach and the examples I mentioned before, then we have a higher chance of success. Also, this can help people in understanding why things are working or not working. This is just a reference from a recent meta-analysis that was published in 2020, looking at the different self-regulation mechanisms that are actually relevant from different systematic reviews. So it is a review of review. And if you're interested, you can have a look at it to see all the skills that were identified, where they have better results, less results, how they were used, the conditions, etc. The other example that I bring you is in relation to motivation. And motivation is, of course, crucial when we talk about adhering to healthy behaviors and behaviors that can protect against injuries, or in, of course, adhering to any behaviors that can help in recovering from injuries. And that was already mentioned today. Motivation is a really crucial aspect. And for many years, we talked about motivation as persistence, as the intensity of motivation. So people have high or low levels of motivation, and based on that, they will engage in actions to achieve a behavior or not. But there is a theory called self-determination theory that actually talks about the different types of motivation that exist based on their quality. So according to this theory, and I'm just going to explain this in a very simple and rapid way, but according to this theory, we have two different types of motivation. So we have motivations that are more autonomous, and we are motivations that are more controlled. Motivations that are more autonomous means different types of motivations that we can have that come from the person. So either I do things because they are intrinsically pleasurable and enjoyable for me, or because I value that, so they are aligned with my values and other things that are important in life, or because I value other outcomes from the behavior. But it's my choice, or at least it's my choice to adhere to guidelines, for example, versus control motivations. So control motivations are motivations that have their origin on either internal pressure. So when I do a behavior because I feel guilty if I don't do it, or when I do a behavior because someone else is pressuring me to do this behavior. And what we know from research is that the more autonomous motivation, so higher levels of autonomous motivation, are linked with a higher and more sustainable participation in health behaviors such as physical activity, healthy eating. And there's a lot of research in the sports domain using self-determination theory. And it's also linked both indirectly by increasing participation in the behaviors, but also directly with mental health outcomes. So improvement in terms of life satisfaction, vitality, emotional aspects that are related with having a more autonomous motivation. And what the model tells us is that to promote autonomous and control motivation, we need to actually fulfill three basic psychological needs that every human being has. So the need for autonomy, so the need to feel that I'm in control of the process, I am a self-determined person, the need for competence, so the need to feel that I'm capable to strive on a given behavior and context, and the need for relatedness. And relatedness is linked with feeling that you are unconditionally supported by people around you and by people that are trying to support in your behavior. So what you have in the left side, which I'm not going to get into that today, is just explaining that the support of frustration of these needs is going to impact on autonomous and control motivation. And then there are, of course, elements more related with personality and goals that would influence this relationship. So what does this mean is that to be able to promote autonomous motivation, which we know is a core element for sustainable protective health behaviors, as well as positive mental health outcomes, we need to promote these three basic psychological needs. So if I'm developing an intervention to promote motivation, and if I want to target autonomous motivation, so increase autonomous motivation and decrease control motivation, I need to use techniques and strategies that are actually going to impact on autonomous motivation. So I need to learn about these determinants. I need to go to the literature, and we have so many meta-analysis and systematic reviews and papers that already synthesize this information to inform me about which techniques can be more relevant. So there is very recent, again, meta-analysis looking at self-determination theory-based interventions in the health domain that was published in 2021 by Nikos Tomanis, that some of you might know. Is a very well-known psychologist working in both health psychology, motivational psychology, and sports psychology. And he has done a lot of work in self-determination theory-based interventions in that domain. And this meta-analysis looked at 73 studies. They found small to medium changes in most self-determination theory constructs in the interventions, and small positive changes in physical and psychological outcomes. Again, this is quite common. And what they found also was that increases in need support, so the 3 needs support of competence, relatedness, and autonomy, as well as in autonomous motivation, was directly associated with positive health outcomes, which is a really, really important result. When we started to look at which techniques we can use to promote autonomous motivation, some colleagues and I identified that actually a lot of the techniques that are part of the behavior change techniques taxonomy, V1, that I showed before, so the general taxonomy that has 93 techniques, a lot of the techniques there weren't specifically targeting autonomous motivation, and very few were targeting motivation in itself. They are very much targeting more aspects related with capability and progressing in relation to the behavior. And what we understood from previous reviews is that every time people try to identify the active ingredients in self-determination theory-based intervention, so which techniques actually promoted autonomous motivation, they couldn't classify or identify these techniques properly in a way that could be replicated and in a way that could inform science development, because there wasn't a classification techniques for that. So colleagues and I from Portugal and all over the world, this was really an international collaboration from all over the world, developed a classification system of techniques for motivation that were theory informed. So a big difference between this classification system and the ones I showed before is that this one was informed by theory. So what we did, using a large data set of interventions, going back to the main theory manuals and foundational papers, talking with experts, we identified a list of techniques that could promote autonomy, that could promote competence, and that could promote relatedness. And the way this is organized, and again, this is just an example, is that we provide a label for the technique, a definition for the technique, and then its function. So what is the technique trying to change and trying to do within that intervention? For example, in this case, this technique on eliciting perspectives on condition or behavior, what this technique is trying to do is allowing for people to explore the behavior with more depth. So increase self-knowledge, which is one of the aspects that is relevant in autonomy. So again, this classification was developed. Yes?
I'm sorry, but you really need to conclude, because we have to change rooms and go to a track and field facility. Okay. Sorry, because we got delayed before, but yeah.
No worries, I'm almost finishing. Because of that, and using expert consensus approach, what we then did was identify a list of techniques for each of the areas. And in the paper, you can see all the techniques that were presented that exist for each of this area. For example, for autonomy supportive techniques, we have aspects such as providing choice. And again, research has been showing how the different determinants can be linked with intervention techniques based on the theory and based on evidence. So to conclude, before you cut the power of my talk, what I want to give you as really take-home messages is that doing things because we think it is a good idea at the time is never a good idea. So we have systematic approaches, and it already was mentioned before, we need to talk with people. We need to assess what are the determinants and the behaviors to actually be able to select what is more effective to change the behaviors that we want to change. And this means taking the time and the tools that exist to regularly assess changes in behaviors and determinants, and also look at the theory to understand how they can be optimally implemented based on the theoretical approaches that I gave you the example of self-regulation skills and motivation, and also based on evidence. And I'm done.
Thank you, Marta. I guess we have time for one very quick questions, because in 2 minutes we really need to move to the track and field facility. So anyone in the room has a question to Marta? A quick one? Okay, so I have a very quick one. This morning we saw Evert Verhagen presenting a lot of things related to prevention strategies and so on, and it's kind of complementary to what you just presented. So how will you place the combination of those two approaches, like thinking of what are the best components of implementing an injury prevention program, so mainly exercises, and behavior change techniques, very briefly?
Yeah, very briefly. So I think, they are complementary, and I think they fall in different levels. So the main thing that we're talking about within the behavior change techniques is targeting the determinants in itself. So if you think about all of those behaviors that were mentioned in the morning that are relevant, what we are saying is that we need to identify the barriers and facilitators for each of those behaviors, and then we bring the behavior change techniques. So things go alongside for two different levels, and I think that's the main way that you can actually bring the two together.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.